This is Chthonia, the world of the dark feminine. Hello, this is Breege Burke. Before we get into this week's podcast, I would like to thank my patrons personally. Gwyn K., Politi, Caitlin N., John H., Tanya T., Veronica S., Gabby, Helen M., Ruth S., Sunny H., Scott K., JRM, Susie G., Eldritch Priest, B. Lupita, C. Roberts, and Jeanette. I really appreciate those of you who have joined recently and who have stuck with me over these years. Our community is small, and there is so much I would like to do in terms of providing courses, conversation on the dark feminine, and extra content, so please consider joining at patreon.com/Chthonia. Now on to the podcast. Hello and welcome to Chthonia, the podcast that deals with the dark feminine. I'm your host, Breege Burke. So this week, this is in the end of November that I'm recording this, and we are moving, obviously, towards the winter season. This is the very end, technically the very end of autumn. I mean, if you're going by the Celtic calendar, October 31st or astronomical Samhain was a period of time when winter would start. But we are actually now, certainly with regard to holidays, if you're in the United States, Thanksgiving has just passed, so people are moving into the Christmas season. If you are of a more pagan persuasion, then you're moving towards the winter solstice, which an event that's going to happen regardless of your religious affiliation or non-affiliation, because obviously when we get around the period of the solstice, we are getting to the shortest day of the year. It is the darkest day, or the darkest night, really, and then we move from that point to the increasing presence of the sun. Generally, that takes until about mid-January or so for that to... It's usually like roughly the first week of January that you really start to see the clock actually shifting back in the other direction. If you go to a weather site and you actually look to see how much lighter the mornings are or the evenings, generally, you see it start in the evening first. You'll see it get like a minute lighter each evening, and it's a little while before you actually start to see that reflected in the sun rising earlier in the morning. So in any case, what we're doing here for the rest of this year, there's going to be this podcast, and I've got 2 more scheduled for this year. We're going to be looking at deities and figures, folkloric figures, spirits, and so forth related specifically to winter. Something I try to do every year. Doesn't always happen. Some years I've deviated from that. But certainly the first of these winter figures that we're going to look at between now and the end of 2023 is known as Yuki-onna. And this is a Japanese figure who is often regarded as a personification of the spirit of winter. Okay, in talking about anything, when we're talking about these kinds of spirits within not what I'm going to call non-Western cultures, obviously I'm recording this podcast in the United States. I'm coming at it from an American perspective. Certainly the way of thinking and the way of education, the way of consciousness that we have in this country is Western. And even though I have a lot of connections in terms of my spirituality and so forth to Eastern culture, what we think of as Eastern or Far Eastern, at least with respect to where we are, when we start looking at Asian religions or Asian beliefs of all types, you're certainly coming at it from a very different paradigm, and we're not talking about things in the same way that we would here. I'm going to talk a little bit about this. Actually, this might be one of the first things I want to talk about. Is if you in Japan, in addition to Buddhism, one of the main religious systems there is Shintoism, okay, which has to do with ancestral veneration. But there's also it's a very, very simple kind of system that venerates not only ancestors but also nature spirits. There's a kind of a need to harmonize oneself with nature that is also reflected in systems like Taoism. And in fact, there are ideas about energy flow or ki that are certainly part of the way in which those rituals may be constructed, or in the beliefs about how one manages themselves, manages their energy, manages life, gets the most out of their lives in its various aspects. So the story the story that I was thinking of as I was researching this podcast, I not only go to try to find where I can find stories of these particular beings, but some things on the background and the cultural background as well, especially if we're not making an assumption of a Western cultural background. And I do use Joseph Campbell in spite of the fact that sometimes he doesn't really do that. I think sometimes he does try to translate things in terms of Western background, although he did spend a lot of time in Japan and was very much enamored of the Japanese culture and the way in which everything in Japan seemed to be created in a way that it was flowing harmoniously. We like to have like hard borders and hard edges and squared off lines and things, whereas if you see these beautiful Japanese gardens and so forth, there's this tendency to try to flow with the landscape rather than trying to force the landscape to conform to the way that you to the little boxes that you want to create. And this is certainly a very Western thing. I would suggest that's something that comes out of biblical ideology, and the idea that we are the caretakers and the enforcers and the dominators of nature. Okay, that belief that we tend to have that's both religious and scientific in the West. Idea that we have some kind of control over that, or that our rationality makes us more qualified to decide how nature flows than nature itself. So that's a whole separate subject. I could point anybody interested in that to a whole different series of of things, a whole different series of lectures and so forth that are relevant to that. But to stay on topic here, I remember Campbell had spoken in the beginning of one of the Power of Myth episodes, and he does talk about this in his book on Oriental mythology, where he says. He talks about a scholar who was at the, let me see what he was actually visiting. It was the Ninth International Congress for the History of Religions in Tokyo in 1958. And of course, these kinds of events, there's many scholars, religious scholars, just kind of like the American Academy of Religion in the U.S. You have, they're massive events that have people that come from all over the world with all kinds of different backgrounds. So obviously, if they're holding it in Tokyo, there was a lot of time spent visiting Shinto shrines and seeing Shinto rituals performed in various places. And as Campbell noted, Western people don't seem to really get what's going on in those rituals, which are very simple. There may be certain movements that are made, certain intonations that are made. But he actually quotes, let me just see if I can find this here. He talks about a writer, and he doesn't actually say who the scholar is. It is not Campbell, by the way, just to be clear. But somebody actually wrote about their ceremonies. Shinto must be deemed perhaps the most rudimentary religious cult of which we have an adequate written record. It is not advanced beyond crude polytheism. Its personifications are vague and feeble. There is little grasp of the conception of spirit. It scarcely has anything the shape of a moral code. It practically does not recognize a future state and generally gives little evidence of deep thought or earnest devotion, which is, wow, talk about ethnocentric there. But I find that comment interesting because, that's pretty much the problem. That's pretty much describes exactly the way Westerners see religion. If I talk in my religion classes and I show students examples of folklore or even just tales of things that I have them look at certain stories about, for example, the urban legends about, the one haunted place in this neighborhood that nobody's supposed to go. And then somebody goes there and says, there's nothing there. And then what happens to that person after that? So I will have them look at stories like that and say, do you see any religion in here? Okay. And inevitably, they'll go back and they'll be like, well, I guess some of the people believe in God. I'm like, no, you're missing the point. Running off the rail there. That's not what I'm talking about. And I always use this as a sort of corrective because I said, this is not about, the church or the synagogue or the mosque that you go to, or, it's not about going there and that particular holy book and things having to do with that conception of God or with a moral code. It doesn't, religion and spirituality goes way beyond that. Okay, and so when you're talking about Eastern belief, the conception of God is in a completely different thing, and it's literally the second thing I cover in my lectures. So it's a question of how well are people paying attention, or even if they are paying attention, how well are they absorbing the fact that even within our own systems here in the West, that there is a different, that there's still things that are part of our folklore and folk life and legend that may fall more into categories that make more sense in the terms of the way the East is defined. Now, within Shintoism, it's pointed out that you're not talking, deities are not quite the same thing. The term is kami, okay? It's referring to something a bit different. It doesn't translate to gods, and that's the problem too. I think even with Hindu religion and with other religions, when you're talking about the gods, it doesn't mean the same thing as when we say the word God in the West. When we think of God, we think of some because we've been told God is, and to use all those phrases, omnipotent, omnibeneficent, and omnipresent. So, in other words, all good, all powerful, and all knowing. And every place at all times, and that we are talking about one being, which if you actually try to think about that, if you do try to think about that rationally, it just isn't, especially when you have these conceptions of God as this Zeus or Jupiter-like being with a long hair, long white hair and a beard sitting on a golden throne kind of image. It really doesn't make sense that there's a being like that that's everywhere all the time. The concept of God that really, even if you ask theologians, goes actually beyond how the mind tends to interpret it. You're talking about something that falls into the field of the numinous. You've just decided that it's got this kind of very personal and judgmental kind of a factor to it, whereas you won't see that in older religions like this one. And the figure that we are talking about today, Yuki-onna, is a personification of winter, okay, as I've mentioned. And so when we talk about this, so we're not talking about a deity or a goddess, okay, we are talking about a type of spirit that manifests in these different forms. And the forms that Yuki-onna takes really vary by region in Japan. I found that to be very interesting. Now, there's a whole lot of information. Wikipedia has really been up in their game lately, or there's definitely been better people on there because there's a lot more information here without me having to pull from 20 different articles. Again, I'm not going to sit here and read from the Wikipedia article. I'm going to pick out certain things that I think are important. But the conception of Yuki-onna is going to depends a lot on the region of Japan, and probably, not surprisingly, on how extreme winter is in certain places. You're going to have a much stronger folkloric presence, or you're going to have a stronger presence of narratives and stories about a being like a Yuki-onna in places where winter is more prevalent. Not that she doesn't exist as a force in other places, but her inflection tends to be a bit different. The variations are a bit different, and I will talk about that. So what does a Yuki-onna look like? Okay, I'm going to start by talking about her appearance and the different attributes, the different stories about her, what she's described to be. And then I'm going to read one story about her from Lafcadio Hearn, who is one of the Western scholars who has done a lot to translate Japanese myth. They're like, typically, if you go to a library and you find a collection of Japanese folk tales or mythical stories of any kind, you're going to find them. They're going to be Hearn's version. So I'm going to read one very famous Yuki-onna story, and then I'm going to talk about. We've talked a little bit about Shintoism already. I have that on my list. So yeah, this Shinto conception and how that fits in, and how. Again, this idea of winter being different in different regions, how that affects the narratives that we see. And then finally, I want to talk about Yuki-onna in her main element as a dark feminine figure, which is a manifestation of a certain type of yin, or certain aspect or quality of yin. As we know in terms of yin and yang, yin being the feminine and yang being the masculine. Yuki-onna is definitely a very strong yin manifestation, and we want to talk about what that will mean. Okay, so her appearance. Okay, it says Yuki-onna appears on snowy nights as a tall, beautiful woman with long black hair and blue lips. Her inhumanly pale or even transparent skin makes her blend into the snowy landscape. She often wears a white kimono, but other legends describe her as nude with only her face and hair standing out against the snow. Despite her inhuman beauty, her eyes can strike terror into mortals. She floats across the snow, leaving no footprints. In fact, some say she has no feet, which is a feature of many Japanese ghosts, and she can transform into a cloud of mist or snow if threatened. And as we will see in some variations, she can also turn into icicles. What is her behavior? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about that. It says, some legends say that the Yuki-onna, being associated with winter and snowstorms, is the spirit of someone who perished in the snow. Well, that's one version, okay? She is at the same time beautiful and serene, yet ruthless and killing unsuspecting mortals. So there are aspects of Yuki-onna that are like that of a vengeful ghost, but not always, as we will see. Until the 18th century, she was almost uniformly portrayed as evil. Today, however, stories often color her as merely human, emphasizing her ghost-like nature and ephemeral beauty. So she's either been treated in the least the way the scholarship has treated her, or the way she's been understood, and I feel this is the way she's understood in the West. I do not know that this is necessarily how she's understood in Japan, although I have a feeling this is the way we interpret what we see in the Japanese writings, because again, these strict moral concepts of good and evil, as I've just described, are not necessarily part of the landscape or the way of thinking. But then, of course, once you get into a more rational age, then it's no longer that she is this sort of folkloric spirit or kami, or what people would view as some kind of a nature spirit, and turning her instead into a quote-unquote merely human ghost, or she falls into that category of the vengeful ghost. Okay, so there's, so again, interestingly too, the more analytical and rational the scholarship becomes, the more the lesser her terrifying or numinous status. Okay, that's now she's becoming something that is just very, rather than this rather terrifying apparition, or sometimes very compelling apparition, as we will see, then she's just oh, well, this is just another version of the vengeful ghost, which can still be terrifying. But now we are dealing something more with the human level, rather than something that is other in a different sense. It says, in many stories, Yuki-onna appears to travelers trapped in snowstorms and uses her icy breath to leave them as frost-coated corpses. Other legends say she leads them astray, so they simply die of exposure. Other times she manifests holding a child. When a well-intentioned soul takes the child, quote-unquote, from her, they are frozen in place. Parents searching for lost children are particularly susceptible to this tactic. Other legends make Yuki-onna much more aggressive. In these stories, she often invades homes, blowing in the door with a gust of wind to kill residents in their sleep. And some legends require her to be invited inside first. So it says what Yuki-onna is after varies from tale to tale. Sometimes she's simply satisfied to see a victim die. Other times she's more vampiric, draining her victim's blood or life force. She occasionally takes on a succubus-like manner, preying on weak-willed men to drain or freeze them through sex or through a kiss. Okay. So we definitely, we can tick all the dark feminine boxes here, okay? We've got the succubus manner, we've got this vampiric kind of energy, and we have this idea of the woman who, in this case, a woman who is like an ice queen. She's this is the terror of being frozen to death, which is definitely something about being left outside or exposed in the winter is something you're susceptible to. Let me just mention here that she has these different, there's different aspects to her. I am going to go over each of the variations, but certainly certain regions. Okay, so in the Ojia region of Japan, there's at least one story of the idea of the Yuki-onna as being a desirable woman. And there's at least one legend in which she falls in love with a human man and becomes his wife. But then as soon as he invites her into the bath, which she's reluctant to do, she dissolves and she becomes nothing but, there's nothing but icicles floating in the bath. That's all that's left of her. Similarly, there is the idea of the Shigama-onna. This is a girl, another story from that, I don't want to say it's from exactly the same region. Let me see which region it's from. The Aomori and the Yamagata prefectures, okay, which again are also in northern Japan. It says that she visits an old couple and warms herself by the fire, and then she gets up to leave, and then of course the old man grabs her by the arm, saying, "Oh, you shouldn't go out into the cold." But he sees that she herself is ice cold, and then she turns into a kind of a whirl of snow. Okay, that's the way it's described. And then she goes up through the chimney and she disappears. So here we see the Yuki-onna as a definite personification. It's like she's literally a snow creature. In fact, there's one scholar that's mentioned who has said that with that, when something, there was this conception that if there was a lot of something, it could birth something. So you could see certain creatures birthed from a very deep forest, for example. A lot of something would come forth from it. This is Yamaoka Genrin, an intellectual from the Edo period, which is the early Tokyo period, says that Yuki-onna is born from snow. So if there was a lot of water, then it would give birth to, there would be, if the water's deep enough, there'll be a lot of fish. There'll be a lot of birds if the forest is thick. And since both snow and women are yin, places like Ichigo, it's said that Yuki-onna might be born from within deep snow. So there's this idea of her as being this snow type being. Now there's another story from northern Japan. I think it's the same region actually, the Aomori and Yamagata region, and also Hirosaki is another one, where there's this idea of there's the woman, if someone is out in a blizzard and there's a woman hugging a child, and what she will do is she will ask people passing by to also hug the child. Now, this of course, there's really no good way out of this one, because if you say no and you refuse, then you get pushed into a snowy valley. Okay, and that's another aspect of Yuki-onna that I've noticed, is that typically one of the ways she attacks is she will shove people like into a valley or off into, down some kind of a hill or down some kind of a valley. So there's this idea of being shoved down into this kind of lower place. If you do actually go ahead and hug the child, then the child becomes heavier and heavier, and what it is really that person is frozen in place because they are covered with more and more snow. There is a tale from, it says in Hirosaki in Aomori, it says there was a warrior who was asked by a Yuki-onna to hug a child similarly, but the warrior held a short sword, I think you say that, tanto, there's another mark, so I'm not sure if that's right, by the mouth, and hugged the child while making the blade go close to the child's head, which allowed the warrior to avoid the aforementioned phenomenon. When the warrior handed the child back to the Yuki-onna, the ghoul, that's how they're referring to her as a ghoul, gave many treasures as thanks for hugging the child. So, if you do something, if you meet the challenge or you do things correctly, or also even if you are kind to a Yuki-onna, it's said that not only can you potentially get a treasure, but sometimes the Yuki-onna herself will turn into gold. And it says, and those who are able to actually withstand the weight of the child, which is known as the yukinko, and last all the way through, they would acquire great physical strength. Okay, so this is a kind of test of how well one weathers, or how one handles particularly the weight, the extra weight of snow, the extra weight of things falling down. And you have this child that appears. Now, children have a curious connection to this legend. There are certain variations in which there's a one-legged child that is said to be a child of a mountain god, and the mountains also seem to be very closely connected with Yuki-onna, probably because it's the mountains of Japan that get the most snow. Okay, so the mountain gods tend to be associated with birth and with harvest, so there does tend to be this connection between the two. Okay, so some of the other stories, just general stories that we're going to talk about here. Yeah, we have the idea, particularly in the region of Nagano, there's the idea of and among others that are mainly in southern Japan, you have this idea of the Yuki-onna as the taker of children, that she, gets children to come play with her and sort of leads them away. So there's a lot of warnings about when there's snow, the first snow comes, especially at a certain point in time, that children are not to go outside because they could be taken away by the Yuki-onna. Okay. Now, in Iwate and Miyagi, Yuki-onna steals vitality. She's said to take the livers from children and freeze people to death. Freezing people to death is obvious. Taking livers is interesting. If we go back to something I've said about Greek myth, particularly if we think of the myth of Prometheus, we know in that myth that Prometheus is punished by being chained to a rock and having an eagle peck at his liver. And you say, why the liver? Well, for a lot of the ancients, the liver is actually the center of your vitality. We tend to think of other things. We tend to think of the heart, maybe, or the brain, or something else as being the center of our vitality. But no, the source of your vitality was often believed in ancient times to be your liver. So it would take the livers from young children, freeze people to death, and let's see, I think I'm hoping saying this place right, Nishimonai. If you look at the face of a Yuki-onna and engage in conversation, or if she calls out to you and you engage in conversation, this will result in you being eaten by the Yuki-onna. Okay, so there's this cannibalistic element. And there are other versions of this Yuki-onna who attacks by trying to engage you in conversation. There are some that say if you try to ignore her, that in fact, again, like with the child myth, that you will be shoved down a precipice or shoved into a snowy, to a valley or of some type. Now, this is interesting because they're talking about how in earlier legend, it says that she is associated with stories of sorrow. I'll read this one directly from the Wikipedia thing. Because old tales about Yuki-onna are mostly stories of sorrow, and it's said that these tales started from when people who have lived gloomy lives, such as childless old couples or single men in mountain villages, would hear the sound of a blizzard knocking on their shutter door and fantasize that the thing they longed for has come. It is said that after that they would live in happiness with what they longed for in a fantasy as fleeting as snow. There's also a feeling of fear, and there's some, it said the sound of blizzard knocking on an outer shoji is called the shoji sashuri, rubbing a shoji. And there is a custom of making children who stayed up late go to sleep quickly when a Yuki-onna rubs a shoji. From real sayings such as the shoji sashuri, it is said that things one longs for sit back to back with fear. Okay. And we'll talk about that. So there's the things that you're longing for, and at the same time, there's this idea of fear. So there's desire and fear kind of at the same time that seem to be qualities or embodiments of the appearance of the Yuki-onna. And so it says, in winter is the season when gods would come to visit, and if one does not pay respects, terrible things will happen. So even if it is said to be things that one longs for, one cannot put too much trust in that. In any case, it can be related to coming and goings of seasons. And so if we step back and we look at the symbolism of that, there's the idea of something that comes as a fleeting fantasy. If we think about snow can come, and it can come in great quantities. It can be very, very beautiful. Of course, it is also very, very cold. But snow can also, with the sunlight and with the warmth, it disappears just as quickly as it comes. Okay, so it becomes this metaphorically, really, of the idea of things that are fleeting, things that are, here today, gone tomorrow. Okay, so there's some of these other ideas connected with her as this kind of woman of fantasy, of bringing people who are alone or who are lonely, representing that fleeting element of, really that fleeting element of love. It's when you think about it, actually, that is actually quite a good love metaphor if we think about the kind of love that people have when they first fall in love, because it's something that can be very beautiful and very tender, but there seems to be a fleeting aspect to it. There's people who can fall in love and be in love for, I don't know, a couple of weeks, a month, and then all of a sudden fall out of love with each other. That can happen, or they move on. Somebody moves on to somebody else, if they are just putting out and withdrawing projections, as I always say in the Jungian sense, very, very quickly, and not really knowing people or getting to know them. It's just sort of a fleeting or a passing thing. And also for people who are very lonely, this could be their experience of love, that it's something that's really, it only seems to manifest for a short time, and then it seems like it's out of your grasp. So, yeah, very interesting. And winter, of course, when we think about love, that we don't think of wintertime as the time when love blooms, right? We think of winter. So this is more of a cold or detached kind of feeling. That like an icy beautifulness to it, or just an absolute fleeting temporality to it. So all of those qualities are there in different gradients. Let me just talk about the variations of this myth. So there's the ones that are cited here. There's the idea of the Yuki-onna as the water beggar. It says this variation hails from Tottori Prefecture, where it said that Yuki-onna travels on wind and appears on the days with a light snowfall. She walks swinging a white gohei wand and shouts whoever she shouts. I presume they mean shouts at whoever she meets, saying, "Please give me water, hot or cold." If anyone gives cold water, she swells in size, but if anyone gives hot water, she melts and disappears. Right, so we have this idea of this woman who, that if you give her more cold, she gets big, she grows and she gets bigger, obviously, because she's personification of this cold. but that if you give her hot water, then of course, as with snow, you pour hot water on it and it dissolves, or it turns to ice, or it just melts away. Now there's the Moon Princess variation, and this one hails from the Yamagata prefecture, where it says that Yuki-onna is the princess of the lunar world, living on the moon. Now we do know very much here that moon is connected here with yin and feminine energy. Her life was filled with luxury, but was extremely boring for her. She was fascinated to see planet Earth below, so she snuck out at night and fell down to Earth traveling on snow. However, coming to Earth was easier than going back, and she got stuck on Earth. Says she used to appear on full moon, snowy nights, pining for her old home. Okay, so yeah, so there's this definite idea. That's interesting. What jumps into my mind, just as with just as somebody who is very familiar with tarot, I always tend to think of the Seven of Cups in terms of her general nature. The Seven of Cups being something that's rather potentially very illusory and fleeting, something that seems real. There's this need to distinguish what's real from what's not real in this sort of fantasy of the way this card appears. But this sounds more like Four of Cups energy. There is a boredom and dissatisfaction that makes one only see what they don't have and not what they do have. And these, of course, all are part of this water flowing or yin kind of energy. So for those of you who, I know there are some of you who listen to this who are also involved with tarot reading and just that kind of symbolism generally. And so that is, that's sort of an interesting association that I find myself making here. Now there's also the snow vampire. It says this version of Yuki-onna hails from 4 Japanese provinces: Aomori, Gunma, Niigata, and Miyagi. Here it is said that Yuki-onna is a dreadful snow vampire haunting the snowy forests looking to feed. She lives by sucking the vital energy of human body, which is mentioned as seiki. Ki, of course, that ki part of there has to do with energy or force. For example, as we use in Reiki, or just the whole idea of ki or chi in martial arts and so forth. There's this idea of ki. She is said to extract the seiki first by freezing victims to death and then sucking the seiki through the dead victim's mouth. Especially in Niigata Prefecture, it is said that Yuki-onna likes the seiki of children, so mothers are warned not to let their children play on snowy nights near a forest. And finally, they have the talking snow woman. This version hails from Ibaraki, Fukushima, Akita, and Fukui prefectures. Here, the Yuki-onna engages her victims in conversation in order to attack. When she meets someone on a dark and snowy night, she calls out to them. If the person answers her greeting, she attacks. But in Fukushima and Ibaraki, it is said that Yuki-onna attacks those who ignore her, whom she grabs and throws into a nearby ravine. Okay, so you're being thrown down into the depths if you encounter Yuki-onna and don't engage her properly or show her proper respect. But you can also be attacked for engaging her. So we've got a lot of interesting stories here. I was going to read you the Hearn story. Let me find it here. Okay, so here is one story of Yuki-onna, and I have read this story in other places. In fact, I was downstairs going through my books trying to find my version of it, but I just thought, let's just go with the version that's here. This story goes, a long time ago, there lived 2 woodcutters, Minokichi and Mosaku. Minokichi was young, and Mosaku was very old. One winter day, they could not come back home because of a snowstorm. They found a hut in the mountain and decided to sleep there. On this particular evening, Minokichi woke up and found a beautiful lady with white clothes. She breathed on old Mosaku, and he was frozen to death. She then approached Minokichi to breathe on him, but stared at him for a while and said, I thought I was going to kill you, the same as that old man, but I will not because you are young and beautiful. You must not tell anyone about this incident. If you tell anyone about me, I will kill you. Several years later, Minokichi met a beautiful young lady named Oyuki. And of course, Yuki from Yuki-onna means snow. Okay? And he marries her. She was a good wife. Minokichi and Oyuki had several children and lived happily for many years. Mysteriously, she did not age. One night after the children were asleep, Minokichi said to Oyuki, whenever I see you, I'm reminded of a mysterious incident that happened to me. When I was young, I met a beautiful young lady like you. I do not know if it was a dream or if she was a Yuki-onna. After finishing his story, Oyuki suddenly stood up and said, that woman you met was me. I told you that I would kill you if you ever told anyone about that incident. However, I can't kill you because of our children. Take care of our children. Then she melted and disappeared, and no one saw her again. Okay. This is interesting because it combines different elements of the story. So there's the idea of the beautiful Yuki-onna who is seductive, but also deadly. Okay, so there's this almost succubus or vampiric type energy to her. But at the same time, she does have the potential to love. But there's an element of secrecy that goes along with this as well. There's something that must not be revealed about her. And so this actually reminds me a bit, of the myth of Aphrodite and Anchises to some degree. Aphrodite is the goddess of love, obviously. She causes all the gods to behave, like idiots, just to put it. Yeah, in other words, it's the whole idea that when you are in love with somebody, you do not behave in a rational fashion, okay? And sometimes it makes fools out of them, the kinds of involvements that they get in because of Aphrodite's influence. So Zeus decides to get back at Aphrodite by making her fall in love with a mortal man. And she ends up falling in love with a shepherd called Anchises. She appears to him and claims that she is, princess or something of some kind of family. I can't remember the exact details of what she tells him at the moment because there are different variations of it. But in any case, he takes her in and she becomes his wife and she gets pregnant. And the child, of course, who is born from Anchises is the hero Aeneas. And Aeneas is seen in the Iliad. He is certainly fighting on the Trojan side in the Trojan War. Hence the reason we see Aphrodite's loyalty to the Trojans rather than to the Achaean League or the Greeks in the Iliad. And Aphrodite is so, and of course Anchises finds out that this woman is actually the goddess of love. But she again tells Anchises, you must never tell anybody about our union. You can't tell anybody that I am, that I'm the goddess of love. You can't tell anybody that. But Anchises, like a lot of men, after, I don't know if it was after a certain amount of drink or just certain things, he ends up bragging to somebody, that Aphrodite fell in love with him, and Zeus punishes him by striking him blind. So there's always, when it comes to these kinds of spirits and things, you will find that there's a certain amount of secrecy that needs to be maintained. And I can't help but think about it. And I've done, actually for patrons, I have actually done an entire podcast on what they call tacere or silence. Tacere being the Latin word to be silent. So so there's this idea of when we are dealing with the hidden things, when you're dealing with the numinous things, there's a certain amount of silence, partially because words are not able to penetrate into that area. You can tell a story about something, but you can't, when it really comes to the mysterious nature of things, it remains a secret because it's something to put it into words is to foul it in some way. If you think about the fact that there were a lot of ancient cultures, like the Druids, for example, who would not put anything into writing because you didn't put these kinds of sacred things into words. Or the old expression, the best things can't be told. When it comes to this level of reality or this level of experiencing nature in the natural world, there are no words. Okay, the closest words you might get would be poetical words. Or again, that's why we have stories, because the stories point us to something, but they don't actually tell us the reality. So this is a woman, there's this kind of feminine force here, and she functions in silence, and she demands silence. She doesn't want anybody to tell on her. She doesn't want her story told. She goes about and does her thing, and and again, this same young man that she's ready to kill, she falls in love with and she marries, or they fall in love with each other. But then again, everything is fine as long as he keeps the secret. There are secrets in these kinds of ways that you don't reveal. But the other element makes me think about wintertime itself, and that is the fact that winter itself is a very silent period. If you have ever been in a snowstorm, when a snowstorm is taking place. Now I'm thinking about this, of course, again, we're not in the mountains of Japan somewhere. I'm recording this obviously in New Jersey, right? But one thing I can say, there's always, I live not too far from they call it a highway. Highway is kind of an exaggeration. It's a 2-lane road, but anyway, there's a highway sort of not that far over, just over the hill from my house that I can hear. And it's very interesting that when you have an actual major snowstorm, like when you have a blizzard or you have something like that, unless you have wind, you will hear the sound of wind. But when you just have like a regular, a lot of times when the snow is falling, there's no sound. There's a soundlessness to it. And let's just say you were somebody who was stuck outside or who fell asleep outside or in the open, and that snow, it would be like a silent killer, right? It would come down very, very quietly. There's something very, very quiet about it. And then, of course, if it is an actual blizzard, then people can't get in their cars. So, again, this is just taken from perspective of here. You can't get in your car. You can't go anywhere. So you might hear the roaring of the snow plows, but you don't really hear anything else. I remember I've woken up in the middle of the night when there's been snowstorms and looking outside, and you can see everything falling. It's falling very, very quietly. I mean, sometimes I even have to turn a light on to see that it's falling. Okay, it falls very, very quietly, and then you can't hear anything. And the road is dead. I mean, normally there's cars going up and down all hours of the night, but you don't hear anything. There's not the slightest roar of anything. Again, except the snow plows once in a while. But it's it's the one time that I said, wow, you can stand there and everything becomes very, very quiet. So it's interesting that you have this idea of maintaining silence here, that the Yuki-onna is, demanding this, probably for various reasons, but I also do feel like I need to point out it's an aspect of winter. Okay, now speaking of such things, I decided to look into some of these stories, like the regions of Japan. I'm not an expert on Japanese geography, so I just decided to look up these different regions and the variations about her that are told from different regions. And what I found to be very interesting, and also I looked up the climate of these areas. So certainly in northern Japan and northeastern Japan, really, up by the Sea of Japan, where probably its northern borders, are closer to regions that perhaps we associate more with snow, and certainly there are mountains there as well. It seems to me like the cruelest perhaps of the Yuki-onna myths seem to come out of this area, and that seems to have the most developed iconography of her. The stories that come from the more southern regions, which tend to have milder winters, not that they don't have any snow, but again, probably the worst of their winters is confined to the mountains. Okay, and it's interesting how there's always a mountain god that seems to be connected to this. But so, for instance, when I'm looking at the idea of the Yuki-onna who holds the child, and that is from the Tohoku region of northern Japan. Okay, which is definitely in this region that has the coldest and the snowiest winters. But a lot of the stories of children being taken seem to come from the warmer climates. Either more central or what we would think of as southern Japan. Japan kind of is on a interesting kind of angle there, the way that it is. But if we think of this as being more in the warmer region, that's where she tends to be portrayed more as a child stealer. Although, again, it's not that she's not portrayed that way in the northern regions. The stories of her taking livers from children, freezing people to death, eating people, that all seems to be from all the northern regions. And a lot of the ones, some of these other ones are, again, primarily the child stealing ones tend to come from, and also the connection to the mountain god, because certainly it seems in those regions you wouldn't be having, there probably maybe areas that are more in the valley or away from the mountains that might not be regions that necessarily get a whole lot of snow, but as most places, the mountains always tend to get snow just because of their elevations. So it definitely seems like, and again, not illogically here, that you have stronger iconography and you have more in-depth tradition about Yuki-onna and perhaps more folk tales and stories in regions where winter tends to hit harder. when you have snowier, colder places, obviously this is going to be that's where you're going to see more stories of this kind of force. We have now, so we're looking at these stories of this woman who, some of these associations just seem very, very obvious, even on a superficial level. She's associated with snow. The taking of children, if you have children who go out, say that they're dressed improperly, or maybe it's warm when they go out and then it snows, and then they potentially could freeze to death, which would be probably another version of, Yuki-onna taking the children away, both metaphorically and, perhaps literally in some sense. That makes sense in the warmer regions where people might be less prepared for winter. When snow, not that snow is non-existent, but not as prevalent as it might be. It's sort of like, if I can draw a parallel with the United States, it's the way in which those of us who live in the Northeast, and certainly the farther north that you move, the more equipped the areas are for dealing with really large volumes of snow. If you go down to the Carolinas, for instance, or Virginia, which is in the south, they have 1 or 2 inches of snow, and literally everything shuts down. There's no preparation. There's nothing that anybody has to deal with that. So it's very funny. I find the same thing is true in Britain as well, particularly in the south, southern part. I remember somebody telling me that when they had 3 inches of snow, that everything shut, like the train stopped and everything. And I remember I think I was in Banbury, which is not technically part of the quote unquote north. It's still it's just north of Oxford, but it's not the north, right? I was in Banbury. I'd worked for a university that has school near Banbury. And before I went back to the actual college to go stay, I had stopped in town to get some provisions before I went back, because I knew once I got into town, the only pub that had been in town was closed, which was probably the only place to get food. And I was going to be there kind of on the off season, so there wasn't going to be a cafeteria that was really open, or the hall was not really going to be open for food. So I just wanted to make sure I had some provisions before embarking into town if I was going to stay, in the college and work. But I remember being there right after a snowstorm, and I saw that the grit that they had put on the ground to melt the snow, and the grit was like, I'm looking at it, I'm like, the grit was just as slimy as the snow, and I'm like, who did, is this what they use? Because that explains why you can't go anywhere, because you really need like salt. You really need chemical salt to melt stuff. And what I was seeing there was not that kind of a thing at all. I mean, I suppose they're trying to be environmentally friendly in some way, but the grit that they had down, I was like, this isn't going to do anything but make it twice as slippery. So yeah, just the idea that not all regions are as prepared for snow. And of course, myself in New Jersey, yeah, I mean, if we had 3 inches of snow overnight, we'd be out by 10 o'clock in the morning. I mean, that's why we usually have delayed openings till 10 a.m., right? It's, you're going to be out again. That's not going to stop anybody. But if we had 3 feet of 2 or 3 feet, 2 feet of snow, which does happen occasionally, that takes a lot longer to dig out from. But then again, if you go up to New York State, or you go up to Vermont, New Hampshire, the New England countries, states that are up on the border there. When I'm thinking countries, I'm thinking Canada, really. I'm thinking of another country. Yeah, you go up to those areas, and you will literally see, they could have feet and feet of snow, and they just have these plows that are just equipped to just push right through that. So yeah, you could have 2-3 feet of snow if you live in some of these regions, and you'll be out to work by lunchtime also. So it all varies on your preparation. And I feel like that's kind of the thing here too. Where the stories of watch out because your children might get taken. Not that such stories don't also exist in the northern regions, but that seems to be the bulk of the tales in the southern regions, where winter could be seen as something a little softer. Perhaps, you see more of this idea of intermarriage between these Yuki-onna and humans, and more of the idea of kindness to the Yuki-onna brings treasure and things like that. You see this, I think, these stories more in the central and southern region, not exclusively, but that does seem to be the trend, at least. Whereas in the northern regions of Japan, this is where you have this idea of the Yuki-onna who is there to kill or to cannibalize, or otherwise represents a mortal danger to you. Because certainly with snowier winters winter does pose more of a mortal danger, not just, I was caught off guard without my coat and I'm gonna, and I'm cold, or, and potentially you still could have ill effects from being out in the cold. So anyway, I just found that very interesting how this one, there does seem to be a climatological difference in the way that these stories developed, which makes sense. And some people will say undoubtedly like, well, see, there you go, there's their explanation, that, we have this snowy winters and it's this spirit. And I'm saying, yeah, but then again, that's a very cerebral, rationalistic way to look at it. But nonetheless, there is also a quality aspect or experience of winter that is not cerebral, that definitely has this numinous quality to it, just like with all the seasons. So it made me try to reflect on the idea of winter as this manifestation of yin that I talked about at the beginning. And so I started to look up what was in Chinese medicine, certainly. Now, Chinese, of course, this is Japan we're talking about, but nonetheless, when we're talking about the idea of yin and yang, which is Chinese initially, and if we're talking about yin as this feminine force, and if Yuki-onna is this idea of feminine force that comes out of deep snow, because snow is also considered to be yin, and there's a whole lot about yin as connected with cold and with the ghostly as well. I mean, that's definitely a quality of yin if you get very deeply into it. If you read The Secret of the Golden Flower, obviously there's a whole lot about this that describes the differences here, which I'm not going to, I mean, that's something I can always do separately, is talk about that book somewhere. But for the moment, I just want to talk about medicinally where this falls into. So the elements associated with yin, according to what I'm seeing in Chinese medicine, the element of winter is water. The organ connected with yin, winter, is the yin organ is the kidneys, and the yang organ is the bladder. Makes sense, right? It's your bladder that wakes you up in the middle of the night, right? And there's your action, because yang is more active energy. The sense organ that is affected in winter is the ears. The emotion is fear. The flavor is salty or bitter, and the color is black. Okay, so I'm just going to read this bit from. This is actually from an acupuncturist, but I want to read what they're saying about this. It says, winter, it represents the most yin aspect in Chinese medicine. Yin is the dark, cold, slow, inward energy. This is in contrast to the yang of summer, whose energy represents light, hot, quick, expansive qualities. The summer weather is warm, the days are longer, and people are out being active. So winter is associated with kidneys, which hold our body's most basic and fundamental energy. It is believed that by harmonizing oneself with seasons, you stay healthier and prevent disease. So winter is a good time to strengthen kidneys. Okay. Rest is important for revitalizing kidneys, which is why some animals hibernate in winter. It is also a good time to look inward, reflecting on ourselves with meditation, writing, or other inward practices such as Tai Chi or Qigong. These practices help us connect to inner selves and support kidney energy. They are helpful to relax the mind, calm our emotions, and raise the spirit. The sense organ associated with kidneys is the ears. And mind you, this is an acupunctural work here. And our ability to hear clearly is related to kidney health. The quiet and stillness of winter allows us to hear more of the world than the buzzing activities of summer, literally what I was just talking about. This forces us to slow down, rest, and relax. The body part associated with the kidneys are the bones, so it's important to pay close attention to bones in the winter months, making sure to heal problems in this area. This is also why bone broths are prescribed at this time period as well. And yeah, it's interesting because this is the time of year, like just after Thanksgiving, this is when I'll call my sister up and go, "Are you making turkey soup with the bones?" Because it's a good time of year for that. You know, chicken soups, turkey soups, things like anything that's made with bones is actually, yeah, and if you catch winter colds and things, that's actually very, very good for it. Now, as far as activity, it says it should represent the season with a turn inwards, with more self-reflection, quiet time, writing, meditation, reading, and other soul-nourishing activities. It's a time to slow down and feed ourselves physically and spiritually. Internal martial arts and meditative practices are particularly helpful. One should go to bed earlier and sleep later to receive full healing effects that sleep has to offer. Well, sure, also because there's less light in wintertime. I mean, certainly as you're heading towards spring, there will be more, but this is generally we're moving in the darkest season here. And I find all of this very interesting. Because I do find that at this time of year, especially as we start to get into November, this is the time of year when I feel like I want to pull back from everything, when I want to hibernate. And literally, my plan for the end of the year is to kind of shut a lot of things out and just work on writing for the end of the year, because I feel like it's time for me to finish some projects and to pull back. This is when I like to do artwork, because I feel like this is a time when you want to connect to that kind of energy. And that just has to do with the ways in which we flow with nature and flow with what's going on at the time. I mean, there's people I know. I mean, I have friends who absolutely hate winter. Oh my God, it's winter, and they want it to be like 95 and sunny all the time, which I absolutely hate. I actually enjoy winter. I don't like it when it's bitterly, bitterly cold. And towards the end of winter, I've kind of had enough. We see a lot of that represented in a lot of the Irish myths, which about the Cailleach and about goddess Brige. And how, and toward the coming of spring, legends that we see that have to not only have to do with the start of winter, but also things that happen around what they call Imbolc, or Candlemas Day, which is around the 2nd of February, 1st, 2nd of February, which is also Brigid's Day. And that's when you start, because Brigid is a fire goddess, so there's this idea of moving into this space that is warmer. And so we have this very, very elemental quality to what's going on here. So our elemental quality here definitely has to do not only with water, but with cold. And also with wind, with ice. I mean, this is certainly the time that we talk about, iciness, ice queens. And certainly references to cannibalism and things like that probably have to do with the scarcity of winter. I mean, it's not a time when anything grows. So this is a time of a lack of growth. So yeah, there is this idea of, if there's not enough food, people potentially turning on each other and cannibalizing each other, right? Or attacking each other. And the vampiric association with the dark. I remember, what was it? It was a graphic novel that came out years ago, and it turned into a movie, which was 30 Days of Night. Because you see certainly this cannibalistic or vampiric theme a lot of times in the mythologies of the far north, around the Arctic Circle, particularly because this is a time of year when when there may not be any daylight for months. It's just like they have summer nights you can have close to 24 hours of daylight, if not actually that. By the summer solstice, by the winter solstice, you are talking about 24 hours of darkness. And yeah, I think that graphic novel was about a group of vampires that move into go into an Alaska town to attack people because they can only function at night. They can't function in daylight. But when it's completely dark out, they can they have full run of things all the time. And I know there was a movie made about that as well. So it's there's definitely you see where this kind of thing can come in, where when it's dark all the time, things that people associate with the dark, and then of course you have it with the cold, and therefore with the famine factor as well. So this is why this kind of winter mythology can be a bit grimmer when you're getting to much more northern regions. It may not be quite as harsh when the farther south that you go, because the effect of winter is not so debilitating, and it's the experience of winter as an element, or as part of that watery yin element, is certainly may not be as, maybe softened a bit in other places, or that because winter also has a beauty to it as well. I mean, winter is beautiful. It's very watching these first snowfall is very beautiful. But again, by the time you get to the end of winter, if you're in this area, you've got the gray slush everywhere. Everything's bare and brown and gray slush, and you're like, okay, I'm tired of this. I just want to see some flowers now. So you do kind of get to that point. But certainly, like this time of year, getting towards the holidays, towards the solstice, towards Christmas for people, and other winter holidays, you're getting towards that time when people like to see the first snowfall, as long as they don't have to go driving in it. But a lot of people want to see that first snowfall. There's something very pretty and very quiet about it. So it's interesting how Yuki-onna, in her different variations, represents all the different aspects of that element, including the idea of her as a water beggar. Like, give me more water so I can either expand or contract, and depending on what you give her, she will become greater or she will become lesser. There's also, there's something meteorological about that too, right? I mean, if you have, although interestingly, I think snow comes down if there's more warm air aloft. The scientifically, minded people here can probably correct me on that, but I remember hearing something about you can have cold, like it can be snowing in the upper atmosphere and just be rain in the lower atmosphere, and there's some kind of combination of the cold and the warm that allows snow to actually come down, as opposed to other forms of maybe frozen precipitation. So I don't know, but it's interesting to think about the way in which this idea of hot or cold water figures into the expansion or contraction of Yuki-onna, just thinking about it sort of from that perspective. Yeah, so what we have here is we have this full expression of yin in its most beautiful and its most terrible aspects. Because there is something very beautiful about winter. However, if you are trapped out in the snowstorm, face to face with a Yuki-onna, things may or may not go well for you, depending on how well you manage it. And certainly from that Shinto perspective, or certainly from that Japanese perspective, the more respect you show to the element, the greater your chances are of benefiting. So probably a good lesson for the dark feminine in general. It's not something that is to be it's something to be careful with, certainly, but not necessarily something, certainly not something you want to disrespect. Okay, that's it for me for this week. Thank you so much for listening. Thank you once again to all of my patrons. I am very grateful for all of your support. Every little bit helps me towards getting the things done that I would like to do. If you would like to follow me on social media, I am on Chthonia Podcast, one word on Twitter. I always say that still, X, and Instagram. And it's 2 words on Facebook. And of course, if you're not watching this on YouTube, the channel there is called just Chthonia, although lately I've noticed it also does show up as Chthonia Podcast as one word also. And certainly if you want to join my Patreon, it's patreon.com/Chthonia. And my website is just chthonia.net, where I have all of my publications, my school, and also the podcasts. You can find a player for the podcasts there as well, plus an opening page that explains everything you need to know about what I'm doing. So thank you again so much for listening, and I'll see you in the next episode.